It's a pleasure to meet you, and such an important topic, connecting wellness and sustainability. We really cannot accomplish one without accomplishing the other. And I want to go one step further and connect it as well with our prosperity. What decisions will lead Omaha to be as prosperous and successful as possible while supporting well-being and a sustainable future, so hopefully we can have fewer floodings like we've seen recently. It's exciting to be here. This is a bit of a homecoming for me. My mom grew up right next door in Kansas, so it's pretty close. Let me introduce you to Harry Flint. This is one of the friendliest people I've ever met, but he faced in his life severe problems with health and happiness. When he was a kid, he lived very, very healthy because he lived in the kind of community that just, made it easy. It was obvious that he walked all the time. He ate healthy food because that was the food that was there. And, he saw his friends all the time, played sports. And then things shifted in his 30s. He moved to Calgary. Every day, this is what his commute looked like. He sat in his car the whole way to work. Then he sat at his desk all day long. When he would go for lunch, he would get the closest food nearby, which invariably would look like this. And then when he would get home at night, he would close his door in his apartment building. And he would do what felt most natural. He would stay there alone, socially isolated. Now, one day of this, that's one thing. But when you go year after year of sitting while driving to work, sitting at the desk, eating food like this constantly, and being constantly alone, it takes a toll on our psychology and our human body, just a vast toll. And it kept going like this until one day he felt a pain in his chest. And so unwisely, he drove himself to the hospital, thinking that he had a heart attack. When he got there, the nurse asked him, "Do you have a doctor?" And he said, "No, why?" She said, "Get one. You have diabetes and you just nearly blew up our machines with your numbers." Just absolutely through the roof problem. So he asked himself, and this really affected me when he said this to me. He asked himself, what are you doing? Do you want to die? So there's two ways to tell the story about what happened next. The first way is willpower. And by this story, when Harry was a kid, he had lots of willpower, and he, would exercise all the time, and he was very healthy, very socially connected. And then he got lazy in his 30s, and then he had a wake-up call, and he became much healthier. And that's definitely part of the story. When he got home, he took all of the junk food in his fridge, he threw it all in a garbage bag, and he threw it out and never saw that crap again. And he walked to the end of the block the first day, and every single day he walked a little bit further and got healthier and healthier and healthier. But there is more to this story. Because, it raises a question, why is it that in the 1960s in the United States, diabetes was a rare disease? There was a few thousand cases. Whereas today, nearly 8% of American citizens have diabetes. Millions and millions of people. Let me ask you something. How many people in the United States today meet minimum guidelines for physical activity and eating well? And by physical activity, I mean walking 15 minutes a day, 6 days a week. What proportion of people meet those two things? What do you think? 15%, 10%? Try 2.7%. Yeah. What Harry Flint was going through, that lifestyle that gave him diabetes, that was not abnormal. Today, being healthy is abnormal. And if that's true, something is deeply wrong. So I'd like to propose that there's another way to tell this story. It's something I call defaults. What is the default way of life in the places that we live? When Harry was young, the default was living a great, healthy life. And then when the only way to get to work looked like this, he sat in his car. When sitting was the default behavior at work, that's what he did. This is the default food. And as I'll discuss, the design of where he lived made being alone the default, as is true with too many communities. There's one more part of the story I haven't told you yet. When he decided he wanted to be healthier, he instinctively knew that he needed a helping hand from where he lived. So he moved to a community where the community's helping him, where he could walk to a grocery store, where there was useful things that he could do on foot, in a kind of apartment where it was easy to know his neighbors. And the guy, he not only got healthy, he went a little bit overboard. He started not only walking, but running, and within a year he said, screw it, I'm going to go to Iceland and I'm going to run a marathon to raise money for diabetes. And now he tours across the country helping people overcome their problems with diabetes. He's extremely inspirational. He's won the Governor's General's Award in Canada. And so obviously there's a lot of willpower that goes into that. But all along the way, the best way to understand what happened to him was the context that he lived in. So my question is, from all this, is when I spoke to Harry about this and he told me this story, crossing that finish line, dropping to the ground, breaking down in tears, he was so proud of himself, how far he had come. He had so much pride in his voice. And I wondered, why don't we build communities where the absolute maximum number of people get to feel that pride? Communities that every day make it a little bit easier to make those choices that are going to make us feel wildly proud of ourselves and happy because we have good, social, meaningful connections with the people around us. If we're not doing that, if we're not building communities that support humans living the best possible life for humans, what are we doing? Who are we building them for? So we need to restore defaults, create places that by default give us a wonderful quality of life. I'm with the firm Happy City. We work with governments of all scale around the world, with developers, on how to build communities that support all aspects of a good, healthy, happy quality of life. We were started by a guy named Charles Montgomery, who wrote this incredible book, Happy City. I recommend checking it out. And what we do is we combine research in public health, in psychology, neuroscience, behavioral economics, whatever it takes, to figure out what is the recipe for happiness. What is the kind of built environment that gives us the best possible life? $12.6 billion. What's that? That is the amount of money that the state of Nebraska spends on healthcare spending. It's a big number, right? It's about 4.6% of the state's GDP. Now, what's funny about that is, when you look at what leads to our health, about a quarter of it is healthcare. 2/3 of it, of course, is our way of life, our environment, our choices, our lifestyle. So we're spending $12.6 billion on just a quarter of that. Now, if our health were a ship, that $12.6 billion would not be going to making sure that the ship doesn't sink. All of that money would be going to the lifeboats for when something goes wrong. Does that make sense? Is that the way that we want to protect our health? To keep making the lifeboats bigger in hope that when the ship does sink, as we know it will, it'll be able to save us? Or should we be investing in making it easier for people to live healthy lives so that they can avoid getting sick in the first place? But okay, Tristan, that's a great idea, but we're already spending $12.6 billion on healthcare. Are we supposed to spend another, $50 billion on preventative health? And I understand that. I mean, take, one successful intervention in Helsinki. There was a study there. They worked with a bit over 500 people. They gave them coaches, they had them talk to doctors, worked on nutrition plans, and it worked. their risk of getting diabetes was cut by a third. But it was very expensive, right? Getting those specialists for each individual. It took 5 foundations to pay for that study. Well, there was another intervention in Toronto. And here, it didn't help 500 people. It helped 500,000 people. And it had the exact same effect. It cut the risk of getting diabetes by 1/3. So what is this magic potion? Oh, and I should say it was free. Free is good. Cost nothing. How do they do that? Well, the intervention looks like this. It is the neighborhood. When people have useful things to do, being physically active every single day, they are much less likely to get diabetes, kidney disease, cardiovascular disease, many kinds of cancers, many of the greatest causes of death in this country. And what was it about those neighborhoods that worked? It's very, very simple. 3 things. Residential density, reasonable levels, available things to walk to, and a road network that was sufficiently interconnected that people could actually walk places. That's all it takes. And guess what? That is the exact same things that it takes to create a more sustainable city as well. And so what's insane about this, though, is that even though this would be such a great idea from perspective of health and sustainability, and as I'll say, economic development, this is illegal in most places. In most places, you are not allowed to build destinations people can walk to. So to put that another way, we are required by law to build communities that put people at preventable risk exposure to diabetes, kidney disease, all of these most deadly conditions inflicting this society. That is deeply unethical. There's something deeply wrong with my profession, urban planning, that this is what we're building for people. Chicago, 1995. Bad heat wave. It was hot. The roads buckled. Does anyone remember, if that was Chicago, how was it in Omaha? Was there a heat wave here as well? Yeah, it was a bad one? In Omaha, it was in Chicago, it was 108 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was an absolute tragedy. Over 700 people died. This is the level of death you would usually get with a severe disease outbreak. There were so many people dead that they had to bring out refrigerator trucks to carry away the dead bodies. Now, what was even more tragic, though, was what distinguished the people who died in this tragedy. There was a epidemiologist, Jan Semanza. She went to investigate what were the qualities of these people who passed away. She asked one apartment owner, what can you tell me about this man in your apartment who died? Nothing, didn't know him, he said. She asked visitors, friends, family. No one came to visit, he said. Can you tell me anything about this man? Listen, you don't get it. He was a nobody, he said. The thing that distinguished all of these people, she kept hearing the story over and over and over again, was that they were alone. When you are alone, there's no one who calls up and checks in on you, so you're at greater risk. But also, it puts you at more physiological risk as well. Us human beings, we're not supposed to be isolated and alone. It physically affects us. Very escalated hormone levels, our arteries harden. The risk of death of all causes for someone experiencing severe loneliness is equal to morbid obesity. It is a huge health problem. And that's bad news, because what's happening in our cities? More and more people are living alone. The rates of loneliness are going up and up and up and up. But what are we supposed to do about it? If we approach this problem the same way we approach the physical activity and obesity issues, what we would do is try to coach people on how to make friends. Well, that's ridiculous, right? Everybody wants to make friends. We all know how to do it. So what's going wrong here? Well, we actually can build environments where it is natural for people to connect with each other. And it looks like this. This is one example. There's many ways to do it, but this is a community in Toronto where people know each other all up and down that street. So what is it that is special about this spot? One of the neighbors here told me that her friend moved to another community and didn't know anybody in the other community. Same person, but in one community she was friends with everybody. In the other community she didn't know anybody. What happened? What's the difference? Well, compare it to this house in Omaha. What is the difference between this balcony and the other one? What's one issue here? Distance, yes. It's too far away. It's at least 20 meters. I don't know what that is in feet, people. You'll have to do the conversion. It's about 3 miles, I think. So it's too far. It's beyond distance where people feel comfortable talking. You'd have to yell, and that's just not comfortable. People won't do it. And you're less likely to spend time on the porch because there's less action on the street as well. But there's also a problem with this home, this porch here in Omaha. Lovely houses, by the way. What's the issue here? It's too close. So why is it that we've built homes that isolate people? It's because there's something that we want, which is privacy, right? We have to take privacy seriously if we're going to fix this problem. When you build porches too close to the street, people feel like they have no privacy. They're too exposed, so they don't want to spend time there. People are looking at their lunch and reading what they're reading. So when you have one like this, it's about 10 to 15 feet away. That is the optimal distance where you can casually chat with a friend. But if you want to pretend you don't see your friend and just keep reading, you can do that too. It's comfortable. And there's enough space there that you can mend a garden, you can do maintenance, and that's critically important because what leads to street life, what leads to people actually being on a street, that sense that it's lively and the chance to run into people, 88% of that comes from people staying on the street, sitting, doing yard work, sitting on a porch. Only about 11% comes from people walking through. Because you think about it, you walk through pretty quickly and you're gone. So it's the people who are actually doing stuff there that brings life to a street. So porches and other elements that bring people outside to be there during all that time we spend at home, that's how you start to build social connections between people. There's a lot more to that, but this is a start. It's also critically important for people to interact with each other. They need to feel comfortable, right? So to see how comfortable people feel on different streets, we actually strapped sensors to their body, biometric sensors, to see their level of arousal and stress on different kinds of streets. So we sent them walking down this street, and they felt very stressed out. This is a very alienating street. Why? Well, because there's very little to see, and for some reason, I don't fully actually understand this. I would love to have a neuroscientist explain this to me. Why is it we, as humans, do not like a place with no visual stimuli? This feels bleak, pushes us away. The research shows people will walk by a blank wall like this and speed up as if they're trying to escape something. On the other hand, a street like this, a jumbled up, chaotic mess, people feel more comfortable here. Why is that? Well, there's plenty to look at. So there's that visual stimuli. But also, there's clearly things people can do. You can interact with the space. You can go in those businesses. This is clearly a space that is designed for people. So people slow down here, they comfortably chat with friends, and they don't feel stressed out while they're going through. So we do need this kind of mixed space that people can go through. But we wondered if this changes how people feel. Does that change in feeling change how they behave as well? To test that, in Seattle, we sent some volunteers out on the street to look lost, looking at a map, basically projecting, "Please mug me." We had our volunteers do this in two places. One, an active street with all that variation and frontages and options for people, and other places that were just blank walls. The difference is truly unbelievable in how people responded to help these people who were looking for directions. In the active wall, people were 4 times more likely to stop and help that stranger. They were also 4 times more likely to actually go out of their way and physically guide the person to the place that they're looking for. It makes us better people. When you create human environments, human-friendly environments, we feel more comfortable ourselves, and that makes us more comfortable to interact with other people in a more human way as well. Critically important. Another component of that feeling we have on a street is just absolutely critical, is level of noise. So when you take, this was a classic study in San Francisco, you take a neighborhood where there's very few cars and they're going by at a slow speed. Most neighbors know each other, right? It feels very comfortable outside to chat with people, to cross the street. It feels like a human space. You take another neighborhood with more lanes, big wide lanes like we're required to have here in Omaha, cars passing through really, really quickly, then it's really noisy. That feels hostile, and people don't know each other as well. These lines represent how much, which people know each other, where the social connections happen. So you see the difference between the two scenarios. And people report, on this street, they feel it's not a friendly street. No one offers help, they say there. And if you lived on that street, you might think, well, the issue is that, people in this place suck, right? No one's friendly. People don't help each other. Sometimes we don't realize the impact that the built environment is having on us. This is bad news for the drivers as well. You folks might have seen this headline. That 20-minute commute enjoyed for so long here has been getting longer and longer and longer, and I have bad news for you. It's going to keep getting longer. As long as we keep building communities where the only option is to drive, traffic is going to slow down. And from a happiness perspective, this is bad. The longer your commute in a car, the less happy your satisfaction overall with life. Not just the time that you're in the car, but overall with life. There's a lot of reasons for that. When you're in a car, you have less of a sense of freedom. It can be very stressful. Also, the longer the commute, the less time people spend on average with friends and family. And that's the major driver of happiness, is those social connections, right? There's another reason as well. The more time you spend in a car, more than any other mode of commuting, the more you're exposed to other people's rude behavior. Something about being trapped there leads people to, on average, be more rude with each other, which again, is very stressful. So how do we fix that? The logical idea is, well, if we have traffic and it's clogging the lanes, and we need to add more lanes, right? And there's more plans coming down the pike to widen the roads here. Now, in every single city around the world that this has been tried, it's never worked. But we keep doing it. It's very strange, but it's intuitive, and so we keep making that mistake, and it never works. So I could show you graphs and explanations in a technical sense of why this doesn't work, but I want to express it in an intuitive sense, to fight an intuition with an intuition. So when you are driving at highway speed, you don't just take up the space of your car, right? You also need the space in front of you and the space behind you. And if you add up all of that space, if everyone's going to go at the designed speed, at highway speed, you need as much space as this house. It's 300 square meters. So you think about it, how many people need to use our roads every day to get to work? Well, it's hundreds of thousands of people. Can we fit hundreds of thousands of these houses on the roads? And if we add another lane, is that going to be enough room for all these houses to fit there? Imagine someone driving this house. Wouldn't be much room for them. They would crash into everything. So the math just doesn't add up. The geometry doesn't add up. Compare that to how much room the people here take up. You can fit a lot more of them, right? And that is why, how about these people? It's even less space. If someone can walk out their front door, walk down the street and buy something, then they have taken no space from anybody else. Economically, this is gravy. They didn't create any congestion. didn't produce any pollution, didn't create any road wear or tear. They engaged in an economic transaction just like anybody else, but at absolutely no cost to themselves or society. Too often, the assumption is, and I see this very much driving thinking in Omaha right now, the economy happens in the car. Providing space for people walking and biking is just to be nice, right? It couldn't be more wrong. It's the opposite. Economic prosperity happens on foot. Relying on the car creates an economic bottleneck that cities can't get beyond at a certain point. The only reason why the most prosperous cities in the world, places like New York and Hong Kong, can't even exist geometrically is because of the number of people who take transit and are able to walk and bike every day. That's what makes those numbers possible. And this is borne out, if you don't believe me, the GDP per capita for United States cities, the more people walk, the higher the GDP. Something I wanted to say there. Hey, you, what did I want to say about you? I'll come back to it. So, there's this hope that we can make it work for the car. If we can just find enough room downtown for them, if everyone could just park, then we'd be okay, right? Well, I'm here to tell you that there's only one downtown Main Street in the world that has succeeded, that has prospered with everybody arriving and parking and getting out, and that is Disneyland. And how did they pull that off? Well, it's because they have as much parking space as Disneyland, the area of Disneyland itself. That's how much it takes. That's the kind of geometry that we're talking about here. Whereas somebody on foot takes up no space at all. And even with Disneyland, they know that you can't drive right up to the restaurant that you're going to and park right there. You have to get out and walk in the main street. That is the basic logic of how these things work. So I want to show you just one more graph, just expressing the numbers of this to connect these issues of health, well-being, and economic prosperity. This is a graph from my home city of Halifax. On the bottom is intensity, the number of people and jobs per hectare. The color of the dots is how many people walk or bike. So the darker dots are more people walking and biking. So as you get more intensity, more jobs and people being located close together, you get people choosing healthier, more sustainable, lower cost modes of transportation. At the same time, what happens on the left axis, that is the amount of property tax revenue. So those same places are the places that are producing the most tax income for the city. But there's the same amount of infrastructure, right? You don't need any more roads in those areas or more sidewalks. We already have those. And so all of that increase in tax revenue is gravy that helps everybody else keep their taxes down. This is the fundamental formula for a healthy, prosperous, sustainable, happy society, is combining the places where we live and the places we want to go so that we can create these extremely vibrant economic places at no cost to each other, and while enjoying the ability to be healthy every single day. So, as you might have also seen this headline as well, Omaha's cost of living has been going up, right? Well, what would happen if more people could choose to not have their second car? Does anyone know how much on average does it cost to own and operate a car in the United States? $9,000. There's the newest estimate I saw from AAA was $8,500 a year. So how about giving yourself an $8,500 raise? That'd be pretty good, right? When you make it a great option for people, we're not talking about forcing people to not have any car at all, but when you give them the option of not having to own a second or third car, you are vastly increasing their income and reducing the cost of living. There's a reason why the communities throughout the United States that produce the greatest rise in income, upward mobility, are places where people can walk to jobs and opportunities. There's another huge issue in Omaha I want to hit while I wrap up, and that is Nebraska's brain drain, the young people moving away. What do we do about this? The local paper said, and I think the Chamber of Commerce, they were saying, we need better high-tech jobs, the kind of jobs that people want to come to. Well, that would work if those jobs move here, but how do companies choose the cities that they want to locate in? Well, they want to locate in the places where the talented people want to live, right? These two things are married to each other. Where do talented young people want to live? Well, a quarter few of them are getting their driver's license anymore, at all. So if we build a city where the only option is to drive, will those people want to move there? 2/3 of young people want to live in communities that offer them a mix of destinations. Not all of them want to live downtown. A lot of them want to live in suburban communities, but places that offer them the option to walk to a local coffee shop, and of course, the convenience, being able to see a friend, being able to live that healthy, wonderful life. That's what they want. That's what we need to build. And the companies, they are moving en masse. This is 500 companies in the United States over a number of years, moved to suburban and urban communities that had higher scores for walkability, transit access, and bikeability. This is the kind of place that they want to move to. There was actually a study that looked at, okay, let's show millennials 2 images and have them rate which images they prefer more. On average, the millennials scored the image on the right, this slightly higher density. We're not talking huge towers, right? But slightly higher density, the kind of density that would really support local business. They like that more. They like the walkable Main Street more. They like the office that's in a community more. And they like to do their shopping in a place that again, feels like a community. By the way, this was their least favorite place image. So we have to understand the younger generation has a different set of preferences. And who are making the decisions today? Not that generation. We need to take seriously, if we want to attract young people to a place, we need to be making decisions based on what they want, right? Not decisions based on what a previous generation was looking for. Need to update what we're looking for. When we recently did a master plan in a rural community in Nova Scotia, and this was just a concept image from the main square where people would gather, and this is the kind of community, not in an urban context, in a rural community that would offer all those things, the ability to walk to a store, to be healthy every single day, to be able to easily be socially connected with your neighbors. And there was one comment from a young woman that I just loved. She said, I grew up always wanting to live in that community from the Gilmore Girls, and maybe now I can. Human habitat. What human habitat are we building? Are we building an environment that gives us the best shot at the best life that we can live? If we're not, something's fundamentally wrong. Because guess what? No one else is going to build us that healthy, socially connected community if we don't build it for ourselves. So this is a call to action. I'm asking you, Omaha, to build those beautiful communities that are going to be sustainable and happy and healthy and absolutely through the roof economically prosperous. Thank you. I gave my final sentence there just 1 second too early, so I want to mention that if you're curious about how to actually implement those social connections, how to do design in a way that supports sociability, we actually have a free report. It's super, super useful called Happy Homes. This is for apartment buildings, but it has all kinds of practical ideas in it, and it's for free. You can get it for free. And also, we at Happy City, if you are doing a design, a development, or developing any policy to make this happen, we'd absolutely love to come and help you out with that. So there you go. Thanks very, very much. Appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I want to also thank all the people who've come before us that have allowed us to be here together today as a community. That's what's powerful about this idea of a sustainability series, is that this is a very local effort, and with ideas like Tristan's coming to us, we can make a lot of progress fast in a place like Omaha. That's what we've always done here, and I think that's kind of in our, it's our blessing and our curse that we tend to be a little behind the trends, but there's also a great will and commitment. We were talking about Harry's willpower at the beginning of the last presentation to make a change, and we've got that in spades in our community. I want to focus on the same topic, so some of this will feel like it's redundant, but the focus will be more on the specifics of the organism. So bringing it in a scale and more about the specific relationships we have with the built environment, what that has to do with the buildings that we'd end up designing too. So a little less about the street and a little more about the buildings. That's what's ahead. But I have the same outlook on health. The way I wanted to preface it is we need to change the way we imagine health because we're dying. It's kind of the great challenge and a spiritual dilemma of life is the fact that it's temporary. This character from Disney really captures that essence for us, right? We know what lies in his future. And it's really... I'm missing a little graphic of a person. So imagine that snowman right in the middle of those two arrows, okay? But that's like us on this path of life. We're assaulted by stressors from the day we're born that present challenges to us. You know, we age, but there's also bad things that happen to us. You know, sometimes we get hurt. We get diseases and illnesses. And the concept of SALUTOGENESIS is that we can have a different narrative to the medical definition of health, which is focused on the presence of illness. Or so if you don't have illness in your body, then that means you're healthy. In fact, health, I think, can be well understood by the ability to overcome the stressors that occur in life. So it's more of an action or a behavior than it is a specific, specific state. It's not a static state. Antonovsky is a researcher that really introduced this in the late 70s, this way of thinking, because he was wondering why some people survived in prison camps while others didn't. Because there weren't any clear distinctions between, no obvious signs of why some people could persist. He introduced this idea of a sense of coherence that's really fundamental to us achieving health in our lives. It relates to us being able to manage the things around our environment, so have some control. Like feel like you can actually act to make a difference, a sense of agency. It also requires that we have some comprehension of what's going on. The world kind of makes some kind of sense to us. And finally, that there's meaningful things in our life, social relationships or goals that we have. These are things that we can reinforce with the built environment. Like in Tristan's talk, you recognize this is a strongly social aspect to health here, as opposed to physiological. But there are things in our environment that enrich our sense of manageability, our ability to interact with our surroundings. So before I jump directly into what I think is really inspiring in a positive direction for our built environment, and from the design perspective and creating engineering, I want to talk about a few warnings I see, just to help illustrate that I think we do have an issue. I was riding in the car with my dad the other day, and he's like, well, I didn't get in all my steps today. He's traveled so many miles in his car that he couldn't get his steps. There's a kind of paradox or an irony there, right? That the fact he was moving his body through so many miles in Nebraska meant that this other technology he was wearing was giving him a little reminder. It's like, hey, you didn't move enough today. So the technology helps us. And it's an example of these little Fitbit devices of, I think, the best case of what we can do to create reminders for ourselves with technology of things that are important to us, reinforce our values. But technology also makes it very convenient to be alone in a car and to drive instead of walk. Technology is really a changing thing, and I think we'll look back at something like a toilet and see it as a blip in time, because they're really not that good of a design. I can't believe we've been stuck with them for as long as we have. Now there's people selling these little footrests to try and like solve the problem of the toilet. It's like, maybe before I die, I'll see a world where we start looking like other parts of this globe when it comes to something as simple as this. But this is an indication of what we accept that becomes norms because of the social experience. In fact, we may think that countries where we get toilets like this are actually better or more developed than the countries that don't get the toilets like this, even though this design isn't as good. We've seen in the last couple generations a great growth in the amount of synthetic materials. And this undergirds a lot of my talk today because it's changed our environmental condition. And it's changed how we as an organism and actually those species that live with us on this world exist. So we won't find a good study that proves that declines in male fertility are related to plasticizers like bisphenol A in plastic. There's a lot of pretty suggestive evidence, and so it's difficult for somebody like the EPA to act, right? To say, like a lot of other countries, oh, let's not use PVC in our buildings, polyvinyl chloride pipe. It's like we'll wait until the evidence proves that that's what's causing this decrease in male fertility. We don't have to do that in the design world when we're making buildings because we are there making decisions and advising our clients. And so another example that we don't have proof that increases in the rates of autism diagnosis is associated with environmental conditions. We actually don't even know what causes autism. It's in that complicated space between genes and environment that's kind of epigenetics. But do we have to be certain before we start to make changes? These are warning signs that I see for us to take into consideration. And this is a little bit of a divergence. I just want to give you a sense of how little we know about the way the materials we are creating interact with our own bodies. And so this is a little bit of a tangent, but normally the way we determine if something's safe, like the amount of lead that might be in a door handle that you touch in a building, or the cadmium that we put in computer chips, we determine what safe levels are for us to be around as humans based on what's called a dose-response curve. So we have evidence that we draw on from research studies or exposure that we've seen in the past. You follow the curve until you find, oh, so at this dose there's no longer effect. The person's no longer getting a runny nose or irritated throat. The symptoms go away. And then for good measure, we say, okay, well let's take 1/10 that concentration, and we'll publish that as a safe limit. So that's how we establish limits for things like I was describing, like lead exposure in products, but also things like the quality of air, like how much toluene or other VOCs might be in the air that we breathe and what's considered okay. The problem with that approach is that it misses the effect that's called non-monotonicity. It's not all chemicals act like that. And one of the common ones that we know a fair amount of is like when we treat breast cancer, sometimes they use a drug called tamifloxine. I'm not a doctor, so I could be getting that right, but I might be getting that wrong, but there's a flare. So at first, at low doses, the tumor actually grows in the tissue before the point which the concentration gets high enough that the tumor starts to go back down. So at first, it does the opposite of what's supposed to do before it's at enough. So at the parts per billion and parts per trillion concentrations, the drug is doing exactly the wrong thing. It's not until it gets to parts per millions, parts per thousands, that you get the therapeutic effect of the drug. Well, a lot of chemicals, like when you get a receipt from McDonald's that's printed on thermal paper, there's a thin layer of bisphenol A. That's the chemical that allows it. Like that chemical has the same response with our hormones. It acts a lot like estrogen when it gets into our body. And we make so much of it that we could measure it right now in the air. It would be here, bisphenol, something that's not naturally occurring. That's just one example that's the most studied because the research community has known about it for 30 years, and they finally have gotten the EPA to act on it. But that was one long story, and I took a little bit of time to sort of draw that out, just to let you know how little we know about the complexity of the organism that is our own body and its interactions with the modern world that we're creating, especially with plastics. So this is just, again, another warning, I think, is that a lot of us are kind of anxious. We're depressed. And this is increasingly the case in developed countries. And if you'll notice the scale, that's like 20%, like 1 in 5. It's not uncommon. So if you looked at the prevalence of some of the diagnoses that are common today, you'll see that 6% of us meet the clinical diagnosis for anxiety. Over 15% of us have migraines a lot of the time. And these numbers are wrong, right? Like all these numbers would be hard to say this is exactly true, but I'm proposing this as a warning that we can start making changes now based on that. So, recognizing that we do have habitat, like Tristan said, we are making choices about how we create our habitat is the first step, I think, towards better design. And this is whether we're designing a building, a chair, a car, or a city. It is part of nature, and so we're in nature now. This building did not carve out part of the world for human occupancy. No, all the organisms that are in a forest can be in here with us too. And in fact, I'd say this is a beautiful space, but this is not very good habitat. This is what we accept as norms. This is like you walk into the bathroom and like, oh, you don't wonder, is that a very good toilet or not? It looks like every other toilet. And they're all equally kind of bad. It's like, because they don't function very well. That's what we accept in our environments. They're all equally kind of like denuded when it comes to the things that are most inspiring to us as a species. We do this kind of thoughtlessly a lot of times. We create habitat. We go about adjusting the world around us to make it more useful or more convenient. One of the ways we do that is by creating light. So there's a lot of light pollution. This is an image taken at night. This is very disruptive, not just for us, but for the other species we live with, because light is an important way of communicating. The light is how our body knows when to suppress melatonin and become sleepy. We do this with noise also. So a lot of species, including us, rely on cues from the acoustic environment, from what we call soundscapes, to function well. And so this background can increase, just like Tristan was saying, this is the part that's redundant, it increases our stress responses. So elevated heart rate, cortisol level, the skin conductance, all these things we can measure. It also has a psychological burden for us too. We create habitat connectors like this one because this moves the species, this moves us. But it does it very poorly, like that. You can just imagine that house he described, right? Each of those cars just takes that much space when it needs to move at speed. Well, if you were a turtle trying to cross this would be very hard, right? I mean, it looks like it would be hard for a human to cross this, actually. This was voted one of the country's worst intersections. This is, I think, 132nd, right, in L Street. So we can think of the things we use to move us as ecological connectors too, as thoroughfares not just for our species but for other species. And if we hold it to that higher bar of like, how would a turtle do? We'll do better for ourselves at the same time. I think that's a great rule of thumb when we design, is think of the species that might be more vulnerable than us and try and imagine how would this solution work for them. This leads to creating spaces for social activity like you see on the side here, this sort of recognition that we might be on our way somewhere, but we might not be too. We might have gone out of the house just to see somebody. Like birds gather straw to make a nest, we gather materials to make our buildings. And we can tighten that relationship by looking at things like urban forestry. It's a sad thing when a tree is cut down, and I think we learn that. We don't learn that to be a celebration, right? Increasingly, we go to funerals, and they're called celebrations of life. I think we could start doing something similar with trees, recognizing that that is part of the process. And if children understood that we planted a tree 100 years ago so that it could become part of someone's home, it would be a powerful connection to that cycle of life that's part of a healthy relationship with our own bodies, our own ecosystem. These happen to be good at creating habitat along the way, so they serve our purposes as a species. I'm talking about trees. They're very useful for us in creating habitat, not just while they're growing, but after they're grown, they sequestered carbon. And that carbon won't get back out unless they catch fire. Urban agriculture, I was really glad that Whispering Roots is here. I don't know if Greg's still here, but for those of you that were able to see, we have a lot to be really proud that that's going on in Omaha. I first saw his work at King Science Center, where I went to school. He wasn't doing it that long ago, unfortunately. That bringing the idea of growing food into our education system as something that's worthy work, that's noble work, and that's an engineering challenge. It's engineering natural systems that can help us do better in design. So it's not a biophilia hypothesis anymore, this idea that we're drawn towards things that are living. We know that. Our neuroscience is showing us that beauty isn't in the eye of the beholder, it resides in our brains. And we all have pretty similar perceptions about what's beautiful and what's not. So stop listening to the architect that tells you that's good architecture if it looks ugly. Just tell them, no, it looks ugly, I'm pretty sure. Okay? That's the world I come from. I got the training, okay? And that's my pedagogical background. I learned to see beautiful things or ugly things are actually pretty. But we can untrain it too. Things like this, random patterns on the carpet, you might not see that as biophilia, but it is. This is a random stochastic pattern, just like the breeze or the dappled shade of tree leaves, just like the soundscapes or white noise. It varies in a way that calms us. And this was thoughtfully done, right? Normally you say, oh, well, the dappled shade, that happened, that just happened. Well, no, the tree did that quite thoughtfully too. And so we can bring this insight from nature into the way we design everything. Even we're trying to figure out how to do this at the company I'm at in terms of the way we design lights so that they change color throughout the day like the Sky Dome does. Or what do we want the acoustic environment to be? Instead of just putting pink noise, should we have nature sound in an office space to allow people to feel more relaxed? So that gets to this idea of how do we structure our buildings. And there's a lot of rating systems that are popular now. And this isn't a talk about rating systems, but I do think they're inspirational. And this might be something you're interested in if you want to follow up on some of these ideas, because these folks have coalesced a lot of the best thinking about where we could head, and they're filling the gap between what is regulated for us in building quality and what is best practice. Like I said, we're pretty slow to update the codes to what we think is the right direction. So this is the well building standard. It focuses on the organism of the human in a building and says we should take care of each of that person's systems. So their pulmonary system, their respiratory system. We need to make sure that the building is serving those in a responsible way. And as a result, you end up creating kind of correlates for the human body systems in the systems around the building. It's a great standard that sets very high limits on air quality, on toxic materials that are used in the building, on lighting and acoustics. Another one is the Living Building Challenge. This takes a different scale. Instead of looking at just like our bodies and our physiology, this looks more at the outer circle of our whole ecosystem and the great context. So if you do a building that meets the Living Building Challenge, that building doesn't use energy, it's net zero. It doesn't produce any waste, so there's no pipe with poop coming out of it. It's all dealt with there. It also doesn't have pipes with water coming to it. It collects its water from the sky. It's truly designed as a building that can live where it's planted without relying on these externalities. And in doing that, it becomes responsible. It also requires compliance with the red list, which is known toxic material, a list of some 20 known toxic materials that are commonly used in the construction industry that are not allowed. Things like neoprene and PVC that are fairly common names, Gore-Tex, flame retardants, these things that we've become very accustomed to, like the chairs we're sitting on. This standard said, no, we're going to start imagining a world where we don't need that stuff. In the middle, in that social space, is Fitwel, and this pulls evidence from the CDC and the GSA. They got together and created a great standard based on the public health perspective. So this probably would comport very well with what Tristan's work with, what Tristan was sharing. And it looks at the way buildings form parts of communities. So what's walkable in a building? And are there stairs in that building that you can use, and do you promote them? What are the food options like in the building? So again, there's a lot of great options and guidance. So this is actually a really simple one. I can, the other two I described first are kind of complicated and a little expensive actually. For $500, you could, at the building that you work at or teach at, you could employ this Fitwel standard, and they'll give you a set of recommendations. They'll give you a score, right? They won't turn you away, and they'll give you a set of recommendations of things you could do that might help you move towards more healthy occupants in that building. So because, like I said, I have to have some pictures of buildings, right? We can't, not all goofy charts. This is this is a decade old now, this project. Sidwell Friends School by Karen Timberlake. It has these nice gardens in front of it. These gardens are actually part of the mechanical system for the building where they're filtering the water. So that's water treatment for the building that's been engineered. So this is exactly what is possible when we combine engineering with natural systems to create best practices. A project we're working on in our office right now is on top of a mountain. This is a Pikes Peak Visitor Center. Very unfriendly environment most of the year. They're pursuing Living Building Challenge, so this is a building that will be zero energy, and it won't produce any waste. And I've been painfully going through all the specifications for the project, making sure it doesn't have any toxic materials in it. Easier said than done. There's a big team working on it, but that's what's possible. I think this is inspiring, that we can do buildings that don't use energy and don't use water and don't produce waste and that aren't toxic, and we can even do them on top of a mountain. It's kind of like a flourish of what our species can achieve when we are intentful. It really proposes that buildings can do more than just remove habitat, that they can increase biodiversity. And that's completely different than most of human history, at least since the Industrial Revolution. Probably even since agriculture, actually. You could probably take it back that far. The act of human development, us creating our useful environments, has resulted in reduced biodiversity in the world around us. We pull things out of natural systems and make them inert. There's not a lot of natural systems, like our bodies are probably the most natural thing in this space right now. That is not our future, though, because we need that embodied life in our buildings, too, as part of our habitat. And they can provide that. We can engineer that. Just like Whispering Roots is engineering hydroponics that can transform the way the air quality in a building, we can do that on all of our projects. So I'm wrapping up. I wanted to share with you some of the warning signs that I see and some of what's most exciting about the little part of business that I do about working on the design of buildings and shaping our capital investments. We have a little flyer that I put together of things you could do at your home, like get rid of the Teflon, check for radon, some basic stuff that's relevant for Omaha too, if you want to get that. But I wanted to take these last couple minutes to talk about what is a community. That's the value of us being here right now together, is what could we do as a community. And one of the greatest things I think we can do is reinvest in our school systems. They're not funded adequately, and this is an easy way we can contribute. These kids are potato pirates, and they're experiencing that wonder that we each have in our lives of pulling something out of the ground and discovering that they had no idea it was there, right? Do you remember that feeling? Right? That is a very high level of learning that should be going on in our schools. And the Douglas and Sarpy County Extension runs a program that brings that type of program to daycares. Whispering Roots is doing this with education. There's a lot of groups that are doing gardening and community gardening in our habitat, and I'd encourage you to consider getting involved in that. There's an intergenerational component that's really inspiring. The way we do capital investment is very complicated, and this wasn't a talk about that. Some of the previous lecture series have gotten into more details on how we actually fund investment. But these guys know, so check out Mode Shift Omaha if you want to understand how we build roads. They will make it more clear to you how the capital improvement plan is written and funded in a way that allows you as a citizen in Omaha to engage and maybe have a say about potholes, right? Yeah, gee, I heard a geez. You also can see which parts of our community are getting planned investments and which parts aren't. And you'll get a little heads up before the next beltway gets written into the plan or the next Dodge overpass. These behemoth projects take a lot of planning, and they take a lot of taxpayer dollars too. And they make us alone in our cars, as we learned earlier. We have not just to focus on what's bad, though. We have to focus on great options to replace capital spending, and that's the last suggestion I want to make. This is more of a provocation or a sales pitch. I love our boulevard system. It's one of the greatest things that Cleveland designed in the 1890s, I think. He was working with Olmsted at that time. So we have a great legacy of this. This idea of green connectors is not something I'm pitching. This has been around for a long time. We know that we need this in our cities. It's been as an ameliorant to the toxins and the sort of dirtiness of cities, but increasingly it can be a pathway towards social reinvestment too. And that's what I think we're ready for. Instead of spending, $1 billion on another overpass, let's put $1 billion into reinvesting in our boulevard system. They're already connecting essential resources, and it can help us address the racial tension that's always been in our community and maybe come a little closer to face with it. Omaha's worse than a lot of other places in terms of our segregation and our inclusion. So this would be an amenity that could connect in an ecological way a lot of important resources for us. This is just one example of a vision that I believe we're ready for in our community. Like I said, Omaha's always been a place that maybe can get a little behind of the latest trends, but is quick to catch up. Thank you.
So just first impressions from both of you. What do you think of Omaha as a strong, happy city?
Thank you. You asked the perfect question for me because I was just thinking I really need to express this. Holy crap, there is so much potential here. There is so much. I mean, I'm so tempted to come back here and work as a planner. Like, this is a planner's...
You're welcome to.
Yeah. This is a planner's dream. There is so much room in the road space to create these really excellent, complete streets where people would love to spend time. There is so much good historic fabric in the core So much opportunity there. And I got to drive around town. I saw these amazing new developments in places like the Little Italy, is that right? And so you have some great developers too. So, and what's going on with BRT here, we can't do stuff like that in Halifax. There is this geometry of the city that makes it possible to have really, really excellent, fantastic transit. So the opportunity here, I just think, is enormous. With a few decisive decisions from the government here, things could turn around or accelerate in the right direction very quickly.
So Tristan, you talk about potential of Omaha. Stewart, living in Omaha, maybe what are some of the challenges that prevent us from fulfilling that potential here in Omaha?
I think we are alone, and I think that's a national trend that you highlighted in your points, Tristan, but I think that's true in our community in Omaha as well. And I'm thankful that we didn't have it quite that hot as it was in Chicago that led to that sad recognition of how many people don't have somebody who checks in on them. So our specific context in Omaha, I think, is inspiring because we have a philanthropic will here to achieve so much. But yeah, we are a divided city too, in a lot of other ways. So that's kind of that's a tough one for me to comment on.
Could I offer a few thoughts on that? So, specific ideas. We first and foremost get rid of the rule that you're not allowed to build safe streets. The 11-foot minimum lanes, that's insanity. At that width, cars will drive too fast. They will kill people. They will create streets where people do not feel welcome. The single most important thing that needs to be done is creating lane widths where it feels natural to drive a speed, where people feel comfortable walking on the street, and where people won't hurt each other. And also, the one-way streets downtown, those have to be made two-way streets. That is one of the look this up, it's amazing, the numbers. Across the United States, cities that have converted one-way streets to two-ways have seen enormous jumps in the success of local business and the number of people walking on the street. And that's both because it's easier for people to stop and get out and go to a business, and because of the cars tend to go much slower on those streets. I mean, it is a kind of magical thing driving through downtown here and just seeing the green lights coming through like a wave. But we need to...
That only works going one direction, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. We need to ask, what is this place for, first and foremost? And it needs a decisive answer. This is for the people who are here as a place, not as a pipeline for people to get somewhere else. Thank you. And then lastly, I'm not here to tell you not to build the tram, but don't build the tram. So $150 million. What could that mean for, the way that this is how you build a tram. Go to Ottawa. What they did in Ottawa was in the end of the 1970s, they built bus rapid transit, just like Omaha is doing right now. And combine that with high frequency routes, right? And then you find out which routes are really performing, where people really use transit. And then you keep reinvesting in those routes, bit by bit, so that you don't treat the city like a casino, where you bet all your money on one big expensive project and hope it's going to be successful. You make lots of small bets so that you can keep reinforcing those bets that do work out. And in Ottawa, some of those bus lanes have been so successful that the buses are full. They can't fit them anymore, and so they're turning them into trams. But you see, there's no question whether that will be a worthwhile investment or not, because the people are already there using that excellent transit to an incredible amount. And so it's that kind of incremental thinking. As long as we stay devoted to a clear idea of the kind of healthy, successful city we want, then we can continuously move in that direction.
So how do we build environments that promote that interconnectedness when we have such cheap land and cheap housing, so we can keep sprawling further and further and further away from our urban core, and we're getting away from the density that we need to be a happy, connected city? How do we counter that?
So luckily, we do live in a housing market right now where there is an enormous unmet demand for complete communities. I mean, there's a reason why walkable communities near good transit, the prices of homes go way up. Well, and it's a problem right now because they become unaffordable. But why is that? It's because we haven't built enough of them. So the moment you build them, people rush there. They want to live there. And so there's an issue in Omaha right now where developers, they find it very easy to build low-density sprawl, and they find it quite easy to build big towers downtown. But it's not very cost-effective to build missing middle, the kind of triplexes that maybe some people in this room could afford to invest in. And like I was saying, instead of relying on a few big bets, allowing many hundreds of people throughout the city to actually participate in creating the wealth of the city and growing it, you need those to make it possible to do those small developments. So changing the bylaws and the process to make that more efficient, combined with these investments in transit and things like BRT and two-way streets, etc., it will come. It will come. You probably do not need, hard boundaries on growth if you make the incentives right and allow people to create the kind of sustainable development that people want to buy today.
Just on a practical level, I think we could be more thoughtful about our impact fees that developers incur when they develop new parts of, greenfield development. We're filling up the county, so that could help. I don't think we have a culture where we're ever going to create a growth boundary. Omaha has always had one, but we just move it out as soon as there's a demand. I think that's the case. And what I've been intrigued by is developers that are trying to crack the nut of the market. And what I've noticed them doing is trying to create all the amenities that are social, like a defensible space, they'll buy like a whole block and develop it. And try and get a streetscape within that development that they can rely on being that active space. And I haven't seen this as much in Omaha, but in the Denver market, the Kansas City market, that's catching on. And I think it's on the way because they're trying to find, these developers are trying to find ways to provide exactly what the millennials want, like you were showing on the screen.
Yeah, that's the other piece there, thank you, is people build a development way out, and it costs an enormous amount because there's very few people. So the actual people per meter of road can be, by our calculations, half or sometimes a quarter of a downtown area, right? So it costs 4 times much for taxpayers to maintain that road. And why do you think there's so many potholes in the road? There's actually too much infrastructure for the number of taxpayers, right? And so if the incentives on the developers, the financial incentives, force them to internalize that and ensure that the number of homes that they were going to sell truly covered the cost of infrastructure, they'd be better incentivized to build more complete sustainable communities. And that has to take into account not just the cost of building the road, but the 20 years down the road when you have to replace the road. That's where so many of these suburbs that seem like they make financial sense in the first 20 years just bankrupt the city later.
So we have quite a few questions here that kind of plays into that about we're just one individual. How do we influence our government to make decisions on our behalf? So what should citizens ask for if they want their government to change the bylaws in order to build better and healthier communities?
Well, most stuff, from what I understand, goes through the city council. So they normally move on the recommendations of the planning department on the improvement plan that's been developed by Public Works. So it's convoluted, and that's what I was alluding to with mode shift. They're helping to dissect this opaque process of investment. And that's the budget that the city has to maintain infrastructure is actually tiny, and woefully inadequate. So that's a whole nother pot of money. And so I think we could get involved there by creating a civic movement that targets the council people as our advocates. That's the way this government is set up in Omaha, and I think we can utilize that pretty effectively.
I think there's so many arguments that can be very effective, but the focus on health, I think, is just so critical that asking for healthy environments, but just given the numbers on how bad things are getting, that hopefully that can help move the needle. But for something like the state not allowing the city to have human scale lanes, I mean, that is an argument about local autonomy and home rule, right? So that these things can be expressed in ways that maybe don't create a political divide. In general, I think it's really important for this to, and this is difficult, but for this to not be, a left-right issue, but to find ways to talk about these issues, about making a financially responsible, sustainable, healthy city in arguments that both meet what people want from a conservative perspective and an equity perspective, because really for all of those goals, it's the same tools. So we need to get better at expressing the common project there.
So there's a question here about technological solutions, and it seems like for wellness and for the built environment, the technological solutions seem easy, right? We know which laws we need to change. We know how to design a better toilet, okay? But it seems that the social disruptions are the real challenge here, right? How do we get our community engaged in your experience across the world? What have been the most successful social movements to enact real positive change?
My mind goes to this internet meme I've seen where this crazy guy's dancing at a concert, and I think there's a TED Talk about this. I can't remember who the guy was, but he gives all the credit to the second guy that gets up and does the crazy dancing. It's like, it takes the first person to start a movement, but it's actually the first follower who's most important. And I'm completely stealing this guy's idea. I wish I could remember his name, but I do think it's true. That's why it's stuck in my head. We have great ideas. It just takes buying in to them. And I see it happen incrementally and slowly. We'll be in a meeting with a person who owns a company, and they'll make a decision, and I'll recognize that they've made a shift in their thinking from worrying about whether it's going to pay back or if the risk is safe, instead to thinking about what they could get if they did it that way instead. And seeing as there's something on the table that they don't have currently. When we create more compelling housing, people recognize, oh, I could get, Harry in your story realized he could get something if he just moved. He could get something doesn't have in his life right now. And I think if we cast the stories that way, you can get more from going to the bathroom than sitting on the toilet.
This room is clean because it's someone's job to keep it clean. The building is standing and stable because it was someone's job to engineer it correctly, to build it correctly. Everything we care about that works in our society, it's someone's job to do it well. Right now, it's not anybody's job to build healthy communities. And as long as that's true, we're going to end up with the same thing over and over again, and nothing's going to change. Well, maybe I'm a bit wrong. There's public health people. It's their job to be concerned about this, right? And they have no power to do anything about it. It'd be the equivalent of if the good person who cleans this building had no access to the janitor's closet, so they had to do it without the broom. That's the situation we're in, where there's a complete mismatch between the professionals who are actually making the decisions that decide the kind of communities that we live in, and the professionals whose job it is to think about those consequences. I'm an urban planner. When I was educated, I didn't learn anything about the impact of our decisions on health. An urban planning degree is a joke. What we learn, there's nothing systematized about it. It's not set up in terms of our responsibilities to you guys, to everybody. And so that needs to change. I'm tired of broad, vague requests for changing the way that we think broadly as a society. I think it's time that we start demanding that the professions who are responsible for these things actually take the consequences of their decisions seriously and start being held to a standard for our well-being, our happiness, our sustainability.
I'll just tag on that there's the mechanism that comes to mind is the health impact assessment, that Douglas County's been trying to make inroads with this, but I think you're right, that the consequence of them is very little. Yeah. And it could be made to that projects to move forward for funding pass a higher bar for demonstrating the benefit to the community on for the health impact. There's actually a pseudo, I think, governmental mechanism already for assessing health impacts that can be adopted and I think employed. It seems like at first thought it might be like, well, you can't base decisions on health because health is so hard to predict. But actually, it can be pretty predictable.
Yes,
what we're finding.
That's right. Specific decision makers have specific impacts on health. It's not such a vague thing as you might think. I have a problem with health impact assessment, so let me tell you about it. So this sounds like a great idea. What it is every time a policymaker makes a decision, they have to assess what are the impacts of this policy on health. And they, at the same time, have to do the same thing for about 30 other issues. And each of them, they're just filling it in, right? It's basically an exercise in brainstorming. It's not an exercise in meeting standards. It's saying, well, what could this have on health? So to appreciate how much that can't work, imagine an iPhone factory where the way that we got everyone in the factory to do the right thing to make the iPhone work was fill out an iPhone impact assessment every time they're about to do something, and then hope that somehow that all adds up to an iPhone that works in the end. It would never work. What you actually need to do is take a step back and figure out, okay, who needs to have what responsibility given their role within this system? And once you work that out, you can actually get an extremely complex, sophisticated, reliable outcome, an iPhone that works, millions of them a day. If we do the same thing, disambiguate our responsibilities for great communities, then we can start consistently making great communities.
So if we are to all leave here today and help make a great community, what tools, what sources do we need to start following so that we have kind of the interdisciplinary mindset to make better decisions in the roles that we are responsible for? What should we be reading? Give us something tangible that we can go research from here.
So I mentioned the Happy Homes Toolkit. I really, really love that resource that my colleague Patty Rios made, and it's just one of the best things, in my opinion, that's been written on how to create environments that support social connections, because it's so practical. Everything I said about making small bets for the progress of the community rather than making a few big bets like you're at a casino for the future of the city, all of that thinking comes from Strong Towns. I think Strong Towns is from near here, but they have a book coming out in October, and keep an eye out for that because that's just so insightful. And then I'd encourage you guys to bug your professional associations to ask them what they're going to do to update their ethics guidelines so planners and architects are responsible for our health and well-being.
You think that's true?
Yeah, I've think the great opportunity for us in general is to be more open to each other's perspectives and more sharing. And we're at an exciting time where science is helping collapse that distinctions that we've held sacred for so long about the difference between our mind and our body, or otherness, or how special our species is from the others. This is a great time. I was moved by the Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow book by, is that Kahneman? I get some of the authors confused, but challenging our emotional basis, for making decisions. And I know that seems pretty removed from this question about our infrastructure policy or how we create wellness in the environments around us. But truly, I think it does start with an intention before that's manifest. And that's why we study architecture to, like a lot of cultural theorists, will look at architecture to understand the values of that culture. I think it's true. The way our city looks ends up being more of a reflection of how we treat each other and how we feel about each other. And it does have a recursive relationship. That's what we're talking about mostly, is how the environment then affects us. But something very big happened in Omaha when they built that North 75 freeway. That was a very powerful social statement that was born of fear and anger. And it's something that we're still living with, and we're still living with the fear and anger.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's give it up. So that is all the time we have today. And Stewart, to your last point there about sharing with each other and showing each other how we feel about each other, why don't we give a big round of applause for Stewart and Tristan for sharing their expertise with us. We appreciate your time today and all the work you're doing in our world to make it a better place for us. Please stick around till about 7 o'clock. We will have all the nonprofits around back. I think there's still some food available, so feel free to eat it up, meet each other. And we just appreciate all of you coming today. We do have another Hubbard Sustainability series on July 11th, where we will be talking about alternative energy. So we hope to see you there. Thanks so much. Have a good evening.